Hello, fabulous listeners. Thanks for tuning in to Old Bodies Outside. This is your host, Brian Peterson. This episode's guest is author Ted Alvarez. He has written several books, including Ask a Bear Everything You Ever Wanted to Know and Weren't Afraid to Ask About Bears, The National Parks Coast to Coast 100 Best Hikes, The Survival Hacker's Handbook, How to Survive with Just About Anything, and The Wilderness Idiot, Lessons from an Accidental Adventurer. In 2024, Ted will be releasing another book titled Hiking Hidden Gems in America's National Parks. I invited Ted on the Old Bodies Outside because recently I finished reading his book, The Wilderness Idiot. In this book, Ted demonstrates that you don't need to be an expert to adventure in the outdoors, and that sometimes we benefit when we go beyond our comfort zone. Ted, it's a pleasure to have you on Old Bodies Outside.
Awesome. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, where are you connecting in from?
I'm out in Seattle, Washington, in the lovely Pacific Northwest.
Okay, nice. Well, I'm out in Kansas, as you are aware, and tomorrow I'm taking off for Angel Fire up above the mountains in Taos.
Yeah, I love Angel Fire.
Yeah, I've never been there.
Oh, you're in for a treat. Taos, the whole area is really, really spectacular. I've spent a decent amount of time there. And before I was in Washington, I was in Colorado for about 6 or 7 years. And yeah, I've just spent a lot of time in New Mexico and Colorado. And that area all around Taos is really special. You're gonna enjoy it. I don't know if you're gonna climb Wheeler Peak, but if you do, you'll have a blast. So.
Yeah, I don't know what lies ahead. So it's an annual trip with my buddies. And we usually, as we're getting older, we used to do more adventuresome stuff. And now we do less, less impactful stuff. So we do some mountain biking, we'll do some hiking, maybe a little bit of trail running. We'll probably pay for a guide to take us rafting, and just overall we'll get our recreation in each day and then just kind of relax in Airbnb at the nighttime, just have a good time.
Heck yeah.
Yeah. So going back in your life, you've written some awesome books, but where did it start for you? How did you get into outdoor adventures?
It's like a lot of people, it started in some ways with my parents, but not entirely. I grew up mostly in Texas, in Houston, Texas, which is not a place that you think of as an outdoor wonderland. But even from a young age, two things kind of conspired to get me out there, which is I loved wandering into like the patches of piney woods and the bayous, catching snakes, things like that. I just kind of wanted to go further and further. And I was fortunate enough to visit Colorado, New Mexico, and my parents were skiers, which meant we would ski like on the mountain, etc. But I would always wonder like what's out there? Like, we're on these trails and here's all the people, but like what's out there if I just keep going that way where there aren't any people? And that kind of stuck with me for a long time. And then but I didn't really camp or do anything. I'm always jealous of working in the outdoor media industry. I have so many colleagues who grew up. The first time they climbed El Cap was when they were 15 with their dad or whatever. Like, they just grew up in this, which is not what I did. But I took a college road trip, and it was built around the national parks. And so a friend from Wisconsin, neither of us experienced at all. Like, we're sleeping in white sands, with a notepad on the sand, just like a Coleman sleeping bag, freezing our asses off. You know, Popping into Glacier and seeing signs of bears and wondering if that means we're going to get eaten that night. Like, just completely dunderheaded stuff. But that was the moment when I was really hooked, when I was like, I sort of took that childlike enthusiasm of like, what's out there? And then, you're like late teens, early 20s, like nothing can stop me. I'm afraid of nothing. So I'm going to go do it. And that's really where the bug kind of bit me and hasn't really let go. So.
Yeah, for me, I was a cross country runner in middle school, high school, and college, and I'd kind of do some trail running and whatnot. And then in my 20s, I took my first backpacking trip, and I remember that first backpacking trip really well. And I remember the sensation. It was like, gosh, this has been missing from my life. Like, I just want to backpack all the time now, and just fell in love with it immediately, and it really enriched my life immediately. It was phenomenal.
Yeah, I completely recognize that. Like the road trip that I did, where we backpacked without even knowing what backpacking was. Like in both Glacier and White Sands, memorably, and a few other places. It's like you have to get a permit, and then like wait, we didn't even have backpacks. We were just kind of like carrying our stuff back with us. We were pretty inexperienced and not really with it, but again, yeah, it was such an eye opening thing that it really kind of it directed both my hobbies and then also eventually my career. So it's just, yeah, hasn't let go yet. So
Yeah, yeah. Hasn't let go yet. That's right. That's great. So, one of the things with the outdoors is there's getting out and having some physical activity, getting some escape from the daily rhythms of life. But there's also the natural component. All that combined can be just so powerful on well being. And I was wondering if that's something that you've experienced as well. How does that affect your well being, getting outside and doing some of this adventure stuff?
I think for me personally, and I think for most people, I wouldn't want to analyze, but I mean I wouldn't want to overgeneralize, but I think for most people it's a healing thing. For me, it's certainly a healing thing where there's not a single time that the weekend rolls around or you have a spare amount of time and you're like, oh, it's such a hassle to pack up the car and get out there. But there's never been a time when I regretted it. And to me, it's this constantly renewable source of calm and peace, and it's the most surefire way. Whatever you're going through, whatever struggles you're dealing with, personal, professional, familial, it's just really hard for me to find anything that so reliably and so completely just centers you and makes you feel both more like yourself, and then also gets you over yourself, like your ego, whoever you are, that all falls away and you just realize you're part of something bigger. And that can happen in a city park, and it can happen in the wild. I think I've read some research about wilderness therapy and how certain psychologists and psychiatrists will actually prescribe wilderness medicine, wilderness therapy to everything from people suffering from PTSD to depression to anxiety, all kinds of mental health issues that people might be struggling with. And in many cases, just spending a period of time outside is equal or better than medication. I mean, this is not medical advice. That's not to say you should stop taking your meds, but it's very compelling to me that there's now started. It's something I think we feel intuitively, which is that we feel better when we're outside, right? Even when you're a little kid, you want to go play outside. It's something you feel intuitively, but now we're starting to get a body of research that backs up why. And you learn that any small amount is good, but it really becomes exponential the more that you spend time outside. And so it really is just a matter of like starting with that, like an hour around the block, and then 2 hours in your park, and then a day at your nearby national park, state park, whatever, and then graduate to an overnight. And some of the research, there's apparently a period where after 3 days in the wilderness, you sort of reach a new horizon or a new plateau where after 3 days the benefits just become like exponential day over day. And that doesn't mean that everybody needs to be outside all the time, but what it means is that if once twice a year you're lucky enough to spend a week, that'll just give you dividends for the rest of the year. And there's a reason why, if you asked me what I did the week that I was in Seattle, this week last year, I wouldn't be able to tell you. But if you asked me what I was doing on the third day of my trip on Copper Ridge in the North Cascades, I can remember it so vividly and just carry that feeling with me. It's something that you take back with you when you go back to those stresses, and back to the daily grind, whatever you're doing. It stays with you, and it of course doesn't have the negative side effects that other ways of coping might have. So
Yeah, yeah, that was a fantastic explanation, and I like that you talked about building up to some of this. Like, I think that it's easy to go and see an REI magazine or other magazines, and it's like, whoa, those people are out there backpacking. I don't have any experience doing that. That's intimidating. And I like the way that you were like, hey, like you can definitely build up to it. You know, go out to your local park in the city, then maybe try a state park after that, and then try backpacking out in a national park after. I thought that was a really cool thing. And then secondly, have you ever read the author Edward Abbey?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I was trying to remember which book of his. In it, he stated, and it's probably Desert Solitaire,
Hmm.
but he talked about how when he would be out in nature for a certain amount of days, it was almost like a threshold. He
Hmm.
really felt like he was reaping all this psychological benefit, and it would take. I think you mentioned 3 days. I think he was saying for his personal self, he was experiencing about like 5 or 6 days or something like that. But
Hmm.
nonetheless, that type of thing exists. And
Yeah.
I think that the longer you're out there, you start really reaping these exponential benefits, as you said.
Yeah.
Um, Not too long ago, so you know how early in your explanation you talked about how going out and going for a trip, like, it can cause anxiety because you got to pack stuff up. There's a lot of different gear components and whatnot. This past August, last summer, I got married out in Colorado in the Silverton area, and
Oh,
I
cool.
wanted to connect with my stepson, who was about to become my stepson, and he had never been backpacking before. So we did a one nighter up at Island Lake, and I remember, like, we were taking all our wedding stuff from Kansas, we put it into a trailer. We're going to drive over to Colorado. And I was like, man, I've packed so much stuff for wedding, all these details. I don't know if I want to pack for one night of backpacking. And I got to say that one night of backpacking, my stepson, was the coolest thing ever. Like, we had such a blast, like perfect weather. We didn't have to sleep under a tent. He saw the
Oh,
Milky
that's
Way
great.
for the first time. He saw like 7 shooting stars. He's counting different satellites floating across the sky. Like, just powerful. It's amazing.
That's great to hear. Yeah, yeah. I mean, that's I have so many experiences like that, and like there are people that I don't see as often as I would like, but whenever our friendships are cemented in those kinds of experiences, and I've had this with family members, with close friends, with people who I didn't even know until I went on this trip, and now we're lifelong friends. There's something about being outside and pursuing these type of activities that just like really I don't know, it just really cements your bond. And that can even be when you're having a really bad time. Like there's a something in the biz that we refer to as like type 2 fun, and type 2 fun is like when you're out there, it's not it's not a good time. You're getting rained on, everything is breaking, you run out of food. But those type 2 fun trips, those are the ones you talk about. Those are the ones that you laugh about forever. You know, it's like even when you're having a bad time, you're having a great time as long as you're safe. Even when you're having a bad time, you're having a good time. And I think that's pretty hard to say for most facets of urban life. Like when you have a bad time, you just have a bad time, you know? So,
Yeah, maybe that type 2 fun involves a little bit of discomfort, getting uncomfortable, and maybe that kind of just like burns into the brain a little bit more. And I've certainly experienced that too. And I know that, like, we're kind of talking in a simplified way, but like I feel like with some of those trips, like, there's a mutual sense of accomplishment when you go with others, and it
mhm.
really, like, I have felt them really, as you were talking too, strengthen my bonds, no matter who it's with. If it's with my wife, my stepkid, friends, or maybe someone I don't even know that well, which has happened to me before, where I was going to go on a group backpacking trip and everyone canceled except for one guy I didn't even know really well. And we went and we became best friends afterwards. It was
Absolutely.
amazing.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it is great. It's really powerful. It's like I said, I think you'd be hard pressed to find anything that just brings so many different, or has the potential to bring so many people from so many different backgrounds together. You know, so.
Yeah. So, do you know what countries have started to prescribe wilderness therapy? Because I think I've heard about it in Canada.
Canada, I've heard of. I would not be surprised if the Nordic countries have done this. They seem to be pretty forward thinking with a lot of that. I don't know that for sure. I'd have to look that up. I know one of the earliest countries to start doing research and prescribing it is was Japan, because in Japan
Really?
they have something, I think it's loosely translated to forest bathing, which and so you can forest bathing is just spending time in the forest, and there's a writer named Florence Williams who wrote a book about it. She's an outside writer, and she wrote a book basically about that sort of Japan being on the forefront of that kind of research. And I think they might have had some of the first, because this is now probably 6 or 7 years ago, and I think they had some of the first medical professionals who could actually prescribe forest bathing to clients,
Yeah, yeah.
just patients.
I had the luck of meeting Florence Williams. So she was getting
Oh
some
yeah,
sort of award when I was a PhD student at Clemson University, and all the professors were busy with preparing for this award ceremony, and they were giving awards to people that had a great influence on getting people out to in nature areas and whatnot. So
hmm
Florence Williams was a great person to win this type of award. Not remember exactly the details of the award, but nonetheless, everyone was busy, and there was a call to the grad students. Can someone go to the airport 45 minutes away, drive over and pick up Florence Williams? And I was like, oh, please, I will do that. And so I got to pick
that's
up
awesome.
Florence Williams and drive her for 45 minutes and probably bug the crud out of her.
That's
But
awesome.
she was super, super great and fantastic. And I have read The Nature Fix. I read it back in,
Yeah,
oh gosh, maybe like 2014, 2015
yeah.
ish.
It was a minute ago.
Yeah, yeah. But it had a big effect on me. And I really, like, it was something that, like, it was like, oh man, like that makes sense. That makes sense. That makes sense. And it was, and I loved how she brought together the research and then explained it in a way that was accessible too. That
hmm
was really cool.
Yeah, she's great at that. Whether she's, I think one of her books was basically like a cultural history of like breasts, something like whatever her topic is. She always finds a way to approach it in a way that's like really accessible, really interesting, and usually not what you were expecting. She's brilliant. I've met her
Yeah.
once or twice. She's great.
Okay, okay. So speaking of Japan, you've done a little bit of backpacking out there in the furthest northern island of Japan, right?
A little bit, yeah. Out in Hokkaido, there's a really, really wonderful national park called Daisetsuzan that sort of compasses the highest peaks of Hokkaido. Yeah, I went out there for an assignment that was really, really fun.
Yeah. How long were you out there for?
I was out there. The trip was probably a 7-ish day trip. It required some improvisation because the assignment was, can you go to a place like Japan, one of the most densely populated places on Earth, and find a truly wild place? And you know, Japan is a really interesting. Japanese culture is super interesting, and that yes, you have this profusion of population and density and people, but then classically, at least, there's a lot of respect for nature, like pulled into their culture, and so you can find a lot of that even in urban areas. But this was like, well, what is the wildest part of Japan? And that's Hokkaido. So if people have been to hear that I've been to Japan, they're like, how's Tokyo or whatever? And I'm like, well, I went to Japan's Idaho or Montana. Like I haven't been to the cultural center, except to the airport. But it was really spectacular, and part of it was that this. So the park is called Daisetsuzan. It's in the middle of Hokkaido. It's kind of the biggest chain of peaks, anchored by volcanoes. They're on the Ring of Fire. Asahi is the biggest volcano, and Hokkaido is known for skiing. It's one of the snowiest places on Earth, and so they get a lot of skiing. But they're not as well known for backpacking or wilderness travel. And there's a hut system up there, and at the time, at least, Japanese tourists and wilderness adventurers were much less likely to camp. But they would use the huts. They would go up and stay in the huts, kind of like New Zealand or the Alps. But there's this huge stretch in the middle where you can camp, and they have some established campsites, but they're not as popular just because there isn't as much of a, at the time at least, there wasn't as much of a tradition of backpacking. And so my whole idea was to traverse the whole chain, and yeah, kind of use the huts and then continue beyond the huts. And I had a guide with me, which was great for the first 3 days. But then there's like a flower. This is kind of very Japanese culture. There's a certain flower bloom, a very specific flower bloom, and that was like her high season. Is like all these like people come and they want to see these flowers. And even though she was like an AMGA guide, I think she climbed Denali like hyper. I could tell that she kind of wanted to continue with me into the bigger mountains, but she's like, I got to go be the flower guide. That's where the money is. And so she left me, and then I just did the rest of the route by myself, which was a little bit challenging. I couldn't read any of the trail signs, for obvious reasons.
Right.
And it happened to be a really heavy snow year in one of the snowiest places on earth. So even though it was July, my final mountain to climb, I believe, was called, I think it was called Oputateshke or something, and it was basically, there was like an 800-foot snow slope at like maybe 40 degrees. And I had an ice axe, but I did not have I had micro spikes, but not real crampons. And so I got like 100 feet into that, and I was like looking at the run out, and I'm like, this is just not smart. And the weather was getting really gnarly, and so I basically had to bail. But what is wonderful about Japan, and I wish we could import it here, is that in Daisetsuzan, on the edges are these tiny towns, and in each of those towns, there's an onsen, which is like a traditional hot spring bathhouse. And so you come down from the mountains and you end up at a spa resort. Like, not a,
Oh
they're more
man.
rustic than that, but you have these like hot, natural hot springs, hot tubs, and the vending machines have cold beer, and the kitchens are preparing like fish that they just fished from the river. And I'm like, we need this now, like everywhere. Like, why can't I come out of Rainier and just like jump into a hot tub everywhere? So it
Yeah.
was really great. It was really spectacular.
Yeah, jump out into a hot tub, drink some Japanese whiskey. It doesn't sound too bad.
Not at all. And they have the surprising part was they have brown bears on Hokkaido. There's black bears all over the rest of Japan, but then they have brown bears because Hokkaido used to be connected to I believe the to Russia, and then was separated. So there are brown bears up there, and I definitely saw tons of bear sign, and then I saw one brown bear from far away. But it was like, oh, you don't expect in Japan to have to be worried about brown, grizzly bears, but they were
Wow.
they were there. So
Yeah, and so probably during the last ice age, the islands connected up to like maybe Kamchatka or
I
something.
think it's Kamchatka. Yeah, there's like the little tail of I can't remember the name of the exact province in Russia. I might be Kamchatka, but yeah, there's like a little string of islands that used to connect Hokkaido, and so Hokkaido vegetation wise is like it's like transitional between Japan and what you would find on mainland Russia, mainland Eastern Russia.
Very interesting. Very interesting. That's cool that you went out and backpacked at the northernmost island, Hokkaido, in
Yeah,
Japan.
yeah,
That's I've
it
never
was
met
really
anyone
fun.
that's done that before.
Yeah, I mean, I know people who've gone there to ski, and I think it's become more and more of a destination for powder hounds. People are looking for just tons of snow, but yeah, it's not as well known for backpacking, and as such was, I'd say the story did what it was supposed to do. It found like a really really quiet, beautiful place in Japan, in a place where you least expect it. So
And it has to be very interesting, just seeing how different cultures interact with nature. And I think that in the United States, we have a lot of different cultures in the United States, and there's a lot of different cultural imaginaries of how to interact with nature. And then also, being in Japan, there's probably differences in how they manage their public lands. And I think that's
hmm
all some stuff that's really interesting. And with me being a professor, I mean, a lot of my research is with the National Park Service, with U.S.
okay,
Forest Service, and we're giving them information to help more effectively manage their public lands, but we never do any like meta analysis to see like how do other countries do this and whatnot. And I'm always curious to hear about their kind of ways they go about it.
well, one thing that was really fascinating, and if you write, I wrote a column for a long time called Ask a Bear that then became the book Ask a Bear, and so for a long time I spent most of that column answering some variation of, if I have X thing in my tent, will it attract a bear? Toothpaste, candy bar, deodorant, whatever, and like by and large, the advice is do not you don't want anything with the scent in your tent, right? You want to put that in a bear bag, you want to put it in a canister, you want to have it away. But the Japanese way of dealing with that was, they're like, no, 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 you actually want the food in your tent. Like their approach to management, maybe it has changed, but at least at the time was
Interesting.
our advice to use to keep the food in your tent, because it I think they don't have a lot of bear attacks there, and so I think their thought was that if your food is elsewhere, it's possible that a bear can get it, and then you're attracting the bear. Whereas if it's in your tent, your presence will innately scare it off. And I'm not
Yeah.
gonna. I've done a ton of talking to bear management experts, and I don't know very many from North American bear management who would agree with that assessment. But to me, it was such a strange, it was such a different approach to that I was really surprised. And also, you know, we're a pretty individualistic culture, and Japan is much more collective, much more like you do everything for the greater good, and it's so here where it's much more like chase your own adventure. I remember when I was there at my trekking poles, I just didn't have I didn't have
The
the
basket.
yeah, I didn't have, or I no, I didn't have the little like the rubber tips on the edge
Oh
of
yeah,
my
yeah, yeah.
trekking poles, so it made it would make noise on the rock, which is something we probably wouldn't think about at all here. But in Japan, my guide was like insistent that I had to, and I didn't have the tips, and we were already in the backcountry, and so I had to tape them up with duct tape because that was the right thing to do. I can't risk disturbing other people by like tacking on the rocks, and I just thought that
Yeah.
was such a different approach to be like, rather than chase your bliss, choose your own adventure. It's like, well, think about the collective. How are you affecting other people? It was just a really, really different approach to it.
Yeah, that was a great example you shared there. It's almost like being considerate of the micro soundscape around you,
Mm-hmm.
and preventing the clink clink clink, and natural sounds are something that's great for health too. And so I guess
Yeah,
maybe that's the thinking behind it.
yeah. It's just something I never would have thought about that. I never even would have thought about it before. So,
Yeah.
ultra lighting, I would just be like, oh no, whatever. It eliminates noise. I don't need it. So
I got my carbon fiber poles. I'm good to go.
exactly, exactly.
So this summer, my wife and we're going to go backpacking in Yosemite. We've done
All right.
we've done some solid backpacking trips in black bear country, but we've never done, and I've never done a backpacking trip in grizzly bear country. And so for summer of 2024, we're thinking of traversing the Wind River Range, and
Uh,
it is an ongoing conversation of how we're going to prepare for grizzly bear country. And so I'm going to put you on the spot and see what types of recommendations you have for. I don't know if you've backpacked in the Wind River Range, and we're mostly going to be above tree line, but we're going to be doing. We're going to be staying away from trails. We'll use trails a little bit, but for the most part, we're
okay.
going to GPS our route and do off trail
Nice.
stuff. So it won't be where people regularly go. But how should I begin my preparations?
Yeah, well, you're going to have a blast. The Wind Rivers are one of my absolute favorites in the lower 48. It's like, I think it's like everything. I'm sure we'll talk more about this later. Like everything, there aren't really that many last best kept secrets, but the Wind Rivers are, it's pretty close. And if you're not going to like Titcomb Basin or one of the major spots, like it's going to be really empty. And I think it's spectacular. Like outside of having the iconic skyline and the iconic, granite of the valley of Yosemite Valley, or the skyline of the Tetons, it like has everything that Yosemite or the Tetons would have kind of crammed together. This just like really amazing granite wonderland, deep forests, solitude. It's kind of the best, and wildlife, and I don't believe that the grizzly bear population density, like that's technically part of the greater Yellowstone ecosystem, but it's a little bit separate. So the density of bears in the Wind River is not very high. So like the likelihood that you will even see one, much less encounter them, is fairly low. I don't know this, so don't quote me on it. But if I had to guess, based on the last numbers I paid attention to, there are probably fewer than 100 bears in the entirety of the Wind Rivers, which is a massive range. So the likelihood that you're going to see them is not high. That said, I would bring, especially since you're going to be above tree line, bring a bear canister, bring as many as you need. If it's going to be, what, a week probably or more, you would need
Might be
to,
7 to 10 days.
7 to 10 days. So you probably need at least one bear canister per person, and you know that actually gets to be pretty easy. Like I don't, as long as you keep smelly items out of your tent, and if you want to be really careful, which is usually a good idea, but especially in Alaska, there's like the golden triangle rule, which is you have your campsite here, 200 yards that way, I believe, is where you have your cooking area, and then 200 yards that way is where you store your food. So that
Oh,
you've just got this triangle set up so that even if bears are coming around, which in Alaska, depending on where you are, they probably will, they'll go to maybe where your kitchen was, sniff around, go the other way. They'll maybe check out your food storage area. Hopefully everything is protected and they can't really get into it, but then they won't really have any reason to visit your tent. So that's like the most conservative way. The most conservative way is to do that. I think like in a place like the Wind Rivers, you might not have to go that far. As long as your cooking area is a decent bit away from where your tent area is, and then your food storage area is a little bit farther than that. You're probably going to be good. As far as on the trail, same as usual. Like I don't know how much you know about bear bells, but like the effectiveness of bear bells is pretty hotly debated. There's not a lot of evidence that they're great. The thing that bears seem to react to best of all is the human voice. So just talk, like have conversations, and eventually you said you're going to be up there with your wife. Hopefully you'll have things to talk through and let her talk about, and that'll kind of take care of it. But above if you spend enough time, eventually going to run out of stuff to talk about, and so then it's just a matter of saying "Hey bear" every now and then, or whatever. My when I'm in Alaska, for whatever reason, I sing like Van Halen songs like every couple every couple maybe 30 yards or something. Just shout something from Running with the Devil, and keep going on, and just alerting them to your presence will be fine. You don't have to be obnoxious about it, because again, the bear density isn't that high, and you're there probably to enjoy some peace and quiet too. But just sort of alerting them to your presence so you never have to. It's kind of counterintuitive, because obviously I think some of us want to see a bear, but then it's probably better for you to alert them to your presence so that you never have to. So those are
yeah.
the two things between like food storage and sort of trail behavior. That's kind of what I would be paying attention to most.
Yeah, that's fantastic. And I did not know. I knew that it was the Wind River Range is kind of in that greater Yellowstone
Hmm.
area, but I didn't know that the density was a lot less. So that was reassuring. I'll be sure to share that with my wife.
Yeah,
Oh,
make sure and look it up. Like I could be wrong, but I'm fairly,
dang it,
I'm
Ted!
no, no, no. I'm fairly certain that it's considerably less dense. I'll put it this way: I've spent an equal amount of time in Yellowstone, Tetons, and the Wind Rivers, and I've seen grizzlies in both Yellowstone and Grand Tetons, and I've never seen one in the Wind
Okay,
Rivers. So that just from
okay.
anecdotal evidence. So.
Yeah, yeah. Well, we'll be out there. If we do make it happen in 2024, it'll be in the start of August. That's when we always go backpacking. My hope is, especially with Wind River Range, I've heard that the mosquitoes can be pretty wild and out of control. And so
Yeah,
hopefully they've kind of died down by that time of the summer.
hopefully. The last time I was in the Wind Rivers for the eclipse, actually, the totality
Mm,
went right over Titcomb Basin before going into the
wow.
Tetons. And everybody, of course, went to the Tetons because it has the facilities, the Wind River, less so. There were tons of people for the Wind Rivers, but it was still relatively empty compared to the Tetons, and it was really really wild to see the to see the eclipse, and kind of like at the lakes down in the trees, the bug. And this might have been the earlier part of August, so probably more mosquitoes. But up high, once you get up above tree line and the wind's blowing, like the bugs weren't too bad. So down by the lakes, they were a little rough, but up in the high country, it was pretty good.
Yeah. Gosh, you saw the eclipse from the Wind River Range. That's amazing.
Yeah, it was that was a life lister for sure. It was like we're gonna do this. You only get one shot at this, really. So
Yeah, yeah. And so for back, I'm going to continue on this Wind River Range piece of the
yeah, yeah.
conversation.
Get
Do
all the
you
data.
recommend backpacking with a tent or a tarp out there?
In August, I mean, it all depends on your level of comfort, and you and your wife's comfort. Like I, there are such ultralight, like tents are so ultralight these days that if there's any kind of discomfort, I don't know how experienced your wife is, or but it's still like a high alpine environment, and like you can do, again, it's all dependent on your level of comfort. Like some people are great with tarp tenting, and they don't care when the weather turns, and if you're really experienced, or they don't care. I mean, and I know they have tarp tents, now with sort of bug shields underneath that'll help with that kind of thing. But if you have the money or happen to have an ultralight tent, just having that little extra layer of protection, without having to have everything dialed, is sometimes worth it. I'd say if you're a really comfortable tarp
Yeah.
tenter and you've done tarp tenting, like, and the weather has turned, like severe rain or snow or whatever, because that's always possible. I mean, I think if you're going to be traversing the spine, you're going to be above 12 feet, which means like you could get snow. It's not impossible. And so, yeah, it all depends on your comfort level, really. Like if you know how to dial your tarp against most weather conditions, then sure, go for it. But if even if people are just like a little bit nervous about bears, having that it doesn't really make that
Right.
much of a difference. But the psychological barrier, I've definitely been camping with people who were way more comfortable, in the tent situation, and it made no real difference. It's just made the difference between them having a good time or not being able to fall asleep because they're thinking about bears. So those are kind of the things that I would think about.
Yeah, that perceived safety goes a long ways,
Yeah,
towards getting a nice sleep. And usually when we go backpacking, we try to just sleep under the stars, and we don't pull
yeah.
the tarp out if we don't have to. But we're big fans of following Skirka routes.
Hmm.
And so we're finishing off one of his in Yosemite, and then it's on to the
Yeah,
Wind River Range next. And so Skirka's routes always go up high. So we'll
yeah,
be, probably up at, hovering around 9,000, 11,000 feet for the most part. So it sounds
yeah.
like it's going to be a fantastic
Yeah,
trip.
I mean, yeah, if you guys are used to following Skirka routes, it sounds like you're fairly comfortable tarp tenting, and I don't see any reason not to do that. So,
Cool, cool. Well, we'll stop with the Wind River Range talk. And so I did want to talk to you though about level of comfortability out in nature when you're out backpacking and whatnot. And so when I was reading The Wilderness Idiot, I think you said something in there that there's some benefit to be had by when you personally pursue adventures that make you feel a little bit uncomfortable before you go. Like maybe your stomach kind of has a little bit of tension in it before you go. And so
mhm.
I don't know if that's is that important for you to pursue adventures that maybe like before you go you're like, hey, like a little bit uncomfortable, so therefore I should do this.
I think so. Yeah, and I think there's an important distinction here, which is that this isn't like pursuit of adrenaline. Like it's not like an adrenaline junkie type of thing where, I'm chasing some sort of danger, really staring death in the eye. That's not really my MO when I'm in the outdoors. And like I think early in my career, my outdoor career, I kind of thought like, oh, well, maybe I will be that. Maybe I will try and tackle the seven summits or whatever. And then I quickly learned that I was like, I'm not either. I'm both not good enough. And like, I really don't have that bone in my body that's like, I've got to, I've got to chase something dangerous to feel alive. That's not really where it comes from. But what I think it comes from is just having been rewarded in the past every time that I have pushed through something, or there's been something that's made me a little uncomfortable, or I feel a little bit outside of my comfort zone. Um, Usually I pay attention to that feeling, because that discomfort, and there's a line. If you feel truly truly nervous about it, don't do it. Like I certainly pursued it too far, where at one point I almost did a hike in North Korea, a backpacking trip in North Korea, and I just had this idea of like, this will be the craziest trip ever, and it would have been the craziest trip ever, and very unsafe, and I'm glad that I didn't do it. But so don't let it don't let it go too far, don't let it go too far.
Yeah.
But there is something about paying attention, and really interrogating that sense of discomfort. Like, where is that coming from? Is it coming from because you don't feel ready for this? Well, then maybe there's a way to get ready for it, or is it just something you haven't experienced? And that to me is where you can reap huge rewards in the unknown. There's always some like calculation. It's not like, oh, I'm going to jump off this cliff and just see what happens. But but that sense of discomfort, at least for me, tells me that I'm on the cusp of either learning something new about a place or learning something new about myself. And both of those things are rewarding. They can be really rewarding. And that's even when things don't go according to plan, as long, again, like safety is paramount. Like don't try, don't get into situations where your safety is compromised if you can avoid it, while also stating that there's no such thing as anything being completely safe, so you mitigate risk, but risk is always going to be a part of these activities. But but yeah, every time that I've pushed through, there's always something to be discovered on the other side. And I think I've met so many people who, even on a very basic level, they are like, well, I couldn't possibly do this. I couldn't possibly spend a night outside. I couldn't possibly go to the bathroom in the woods. I've never done it before. How in the heck does one poop outside? Like, so after bears, the thing that people who I take on, their maiden camping voyages, the thing outside of bears that most terrifies people is going to the bathroom in the woods. And it's like this big hurdle. And, once you do it, you are like, oh, I was actually built for this. There's all of us, I believe, have more of a sort of institutional knowledge. Like we are not different biologically from people, 10 years ago, 100 years ago, 4,000 years ago, 40,000 years ago. You will know what to do in ways that will surprise you. So that's why I've just, and I've seen it outside of myself. Like, maybe I'm willing to push myself into places that are truly uncomfortable. But then I just have so many experiences with friends, family, and I consider myself very fortunate to have been the part of first experience for somebody. And I try to make it as comfortable as I can, obviously, but there's some point in that trip where somebody's they're gonna have to face something within themselves and get over it. And I don't know a single person yet from any of these stories who wishes they hadn't done it. I haven't met that person. I haven't met the person who hasn't been rewarded from sort of pushing past that discomfort.
Yeah, yeah, and earlier on your explanation, I liked that you mentioned that discomfort it's a mental signal to you need to be checking yourself in terms of like, hey, is that discomfort there because I didn't plan well enough? Is that going to put me into a situation that's going to be extremely unsafe? Well, then I probably shouldn't do it, right? Like, I mean, this is
Yeah,
just your body and your mind messaging to you, and so it's important to tap into that and say, what's my mind telling me here? Is it because it's an experience I've never had, but I've planned accordingly, everything appears safe? Well, then maybe I should go for it and maybe push the bounds of my comfort zone and see what that's like and see what types of benefits come from learning about that place or about myself. But I think that was a really good point you made, and that this is a signal from your mind, and it is important to listen to that information and make sure that you are well prepared before you step into a situation that is going to be uncomfortable. But I feel like there is a lot to be gained from those experiences, and sometimes like just a heightened sense of, I don't know, feeling alive comes with it too,
absolutely.
especially. Yeah.
Yeah, the feeling alive thing is like, I think like we're just, it's great. Like, I mean, and you can look at it both ways. Like, one of my favorite things after a wilderness trip, I have this joke with almost a ritual that I pull with almost anyone I'm out there with, is like, at what point, depending on the length of the trip, when is it okay to start talking about your first meal when you're out? Because you don't want to talk about it 2 days before and be thinking about pizza and burgers and tacos like day three. There's 3 days to go and it's so far away and you're still eating oatmeal and whatever. Um, but at one point, like, there is that anticipation where it's like, what is this burger going to taste like? Are we going to get burgers? Are we going to get pizza? Are we going to have a shower? Like, whatever your first meal is just, it's the greatest meal you've ever had in your life. So it makes you appreciate what we have, but then it also helps you realize how little of that we need. Like, it truly is convenient. Like, you really don't need so much of what we have around us to be a functional, happy, healthy person existing in the world. And you're just not gonna, you'll never encounter that if you don't get out there and kind of push past some of those things. Like, what if I can't have a soda on demand? It's like, you're gonna be fine. It's gonna be okay. that soda is just going to be that much better on the other side. So
It certainly will be, and I've definitely experienced that myself. But while out backpacking, one thing that I really enjoy a lot is it's pretty much, hey, I'm eating the food I have.
mhm.
I'm going to walk from point A to point B. I'm going to stop when I see something cool. I'm going to stop when I need a rest. But I don't have 20 different sodas I need to decide which one to choose to drink that day. It's like I got what I packed and that's it. So there's not a lot of decision process going on
Yeah,
for like, my amenities. And I think that's something that actually kind of calms my anxiety, having a little bit more simplistic approach to decision making. And that ends up making my experience that much better.
completely. We exist in decision fatigue. And like, I think I read somewhere that to combat decision fatigue, Obama had like 5 suits or something, or like 3 to 5. You'd think the president of the United States would have a billion suits to choose from, right? But he very
Right.
specifically was like, I have 5 suits in 5 different colors for every occasion. And that's so that I don't have to spend my time thinking about what I'm supposed to wear. I grab the color that is supposed to work for that day and I'm done. And we're hobbled by decision fatigue. We have so many choices. We're surrounded by all of this, and you know being able to really pull down the veil and see like what is essential about the world and essential about being human which is like, are you warm, are you safe, are you well fed, are you hungry, are you thirsty, like these things where it's just very simple. It's not like, who am I going to see today, this weekend, what are going to be my plans, where are we going to go, what are we going to eat when we get there. It's just being able to be fully present and be like, I have chosen to be here with this person, or by myself. I have chosen to experience this at this moment. Yeah, all of that decision fatigue is gone, and you are just existing, and you are as present as you possibly can be. And there's other ways to be present. There's meditation. There's plenty of things people do, but that this is just like a shortcut. Like, I've meditated some. It's like an ongoing thing. I have a buddy who's great at it, and he'll kind of like give me tips, and I just like, maybe I'm too squirrely, where I'll try, but I can't. It's harder for me to access. Whereas going outside, it's just instant. It's just you are present. You're forced to be present, and that's it's a great way to be, I think.
It helps me a lot. And when I'm at home and I'm tending to my career and my family and my life, I have a hard time falling asleep at night because I start focusing on the decisions I need to make the next day. And when I'm out
Yeah,
backpacking, I don't have those decisions to be thinking about, and I end up falling asleep a lot easier.
absolutely. It's so many things that I think we build up about as like how we identify. We live in a fairly egocentric society, and that's just the way it is. And so you're like, who am I? Like, what is my career? Like, who are my friends? Like, what do I mean to all these other people in society? And then you go into the wilderness, and all the ego driven concerns fall away. Like, it doesn't like,
Yeah.
I could be in the middle of the woods. I might not have a job right now. Like, I don't know if anybody knows that I'm a writer or cares, or whatever, or how whatever's happening in my life. It is just me and the world in front of me, and that is being able to kind of turn away from your ego when we're just self reinforced by that through everything. And being able to do that is just like a privilege, where you're just like, I'm not looking inward, I'm turning outward, and by turning outward, actually learning something about myself.
Yeah, yeah, it certainly is a privilege to be able to do some of these trips and whatnot. And I think that you had a really great point about the egocentric aspect of society. We're constantly like, hey, like trying to, meet some certain merits with our career, or maybe
Mhm.
it's sometimes some social capital or whatever it
Sure.
is. And like that stuff just doesn't really exist out there. Like, if I passed you on the trail, there's no way I would know that you've written, I don't know how many books I listed in the introduction, 4 or 5, but you just be
Yeah.
another backpacker out there that
Yeah.
essentially looks like hiker trash.
Yeah, absolutely. We're all smelly. It's a great equalizer. And I don't know about you, but like, even when the weather's terrible, it's pretty hard to find somebody in a bad mood. Like, even I remember I was in Canada, and like the weather, it had been like 7 or 8 days of rain, like a trip in Canada that I'd been planning for months with a girlfriend at the time. And you get out there, and it just doesn't go your way. Like it's raining for like 6 days straight, and all the tents are failing, and like it's just it's a slog. But then like I ended up under like a giant tree, like with 4 or 5 other backpackers who I didn't know, and there we all are laughing, and like one of them's like, well, I was saving this for the end of the trip, but now seems like a time for me to share my tequila or whatever. And you're laughing with strangers for a minute. It's just like, even when the situation's pretty rough, like you don't see people in bad moods out there.
And you know exactly what you're talking about. The culture of, I don't know if I want to call it culture, but social interactions are a little bit different. Like if I'm walking down the street, unless I'm in a super rural area where there's not a lot of people, I'm not saying hi to every person.
Yeah.
But on the trail, like if I pass someone or if I pass someone anywhere backpacking, even if it's off trail, whatever, I'm going to say hi to them. And I'll
Yeah.
probably end up talking to them for a few minutes. And like, I
Yeah.
don't do that on a day to day basis.
No, you ask about, if I walk to my neighborhood coffee shop, I'm not asking anyone about the weather or what they have at the coffee shop, whereas on the trail, you're like, where are you coming from? What did you see? Do I need to know? What can I share with you? It's just bringing things down to like just basics a little bit. And that includes like basic human decency.
Yeah, it does. And you know, the trail works as this conduit. So I'm thinking now of the Pacific Crest Trail. So I was on the Pacific Crest Trail back in 2009. I spent about 3 months out there, and I covered
Okay.
I covered California pretty much. And for those listening out there, the Pacific Crest Trail is a long distance hiking trail. It's about 2,650 miles, spans from Mexico to Washington, and blazes through California, Oregon, and Washington. And on the Pacific Crest Trail, the passage, and this was in 2009, so it was not at the technological level that we have now. There was a lot of oral transmission of information.
Mm-hmm.
Like what's in that town, where did you camp, and especially where's the nearest water source when you're going through some
Yeah.
desert portions of California. And that was something that was really cool. Like we're just like, hey, the strangers come up on the trail. I'm going to ask them what's their knowledge about, and what have they learned about on this trail? Because I need that information to also have find the water.
Hmm. Absolutely, absolutely. I'm not competing with you for a table at a restaurant. I'm going to help you find out where water is because we all need this. So,
Yeah, and help me find some water. It's awesome.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So one of the things that it came up recently, I think that it's kind of changed a little bit, but there with social media, there's a lot of people posting about like, hey, this enticing waterfall. I went out there with my friends and we hung out. It was so beautiful. And here's a picture. Here's the exact location. Here's the GPS coordinates.
Hmm.
And then there was some backlash to that because then the waterfall would become popular. There'd be crowding. There might be people out there who aren't knowledgeable of, say, leave no trace ethic and whatnot. And so that kind of started happening for a little while. And then from my perception, it seemed like then there was the opposite where people were like, well, hey, like that's gatekeeping. Like people don't know how to find information about that waterfall. And, they're going to find it through social media. And then they get to go there and they get to have, physical exercise to hike there. And they get to have the mental benefits of being in nature. And they get to have their bond strengthened with their friends and family when they're there. And so, with your research and your writings and whatnot, have you come across that type of gatekeeping and how people navigate that?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is like one of the central tensions of our time, and like this is going to be. There's a section in my upcoming book that I just finished working on it, trying to untangle it because I think that's going to be the central question of wildland management and wildland access over the next probably couple of decades. Hopefully we'll come to some sort of conclusion that works for everything, but there's just that tension between access and preservation or conservation, and that I don't see that tension going away because both of those things are important and like vital to these places. And I think I mentioned earlier that I've been on both sides. And one side of it is I wrote a column that was controversial at the time, and it was like why I spoil your favorite hike. Where at Backpacker, I was on the destinations team, and a lot of my assignments, a lot of my goals were to find out where that precious, no crowds kind of hike is, and to ferret out routes and to talk to people. And, so I'm the person who's showing up and possibly spoiling your favorite fishing hole, or spoiling your favorite route, or mining people for information to share it. And then the my justification at the time, and I think it still is partially true, but not entirely true, is that these places need a constituency. They need it, you can keep it secret to yourself, but if I don't think we should believe that just because something's been set aside as wilderness or as a park that it will always be that way. If anything, we've probably learned a lot that our governmental institutions and things that we think will always be there may or may not be there. So it's important for any wild place to have people who love it, so that when the time comes to protect it, there are voices who are going to stand up and do that. So that was my justification at the time. But then, since then, there's been just such an uptick in park visitation, and I have enough friends and sources and contacts within the Park Service that, you know, especially with the rise of influencer culture, you really would see places that are just getting absolutely hammered beyond recognition, and that are really in real risk of certainly not being the same, and possibly being, ruined, depending on your perspective. Like, there's a place up here in Washington called the Enchantments, and the Enchantments are, I don't know if you know about them, but they're kind of in the Central Cascades. And there's this beautiful high alpine, granite peaks with all these like beautiful green emerald tarns, and it's just really, really spectacular. But it's really small. Like, the Enchantments are probably, it's maybe a 7 mile long, maybe even shorter valley, and then hemmed in by mountains. So, like, pretty tiny. And it's just been absolutely hammered and grammed within an inch of its life. And our park services and wilderness personnel are perpetually underfunded, understaffed. There's just no way to keep up. And so, year over year, it's been pretty eye opening to see how this place has been impacted. And so, I think I can understand that, for a while, the park line was like, do not tag things, do not take photos of things, because you're just going to attract people to it. And on some level, I understand that, because they want to manage it, they want to protect it, they're at the limit of their powers. But then, on the other hand, the cat is kind of out of the bag. Like, it's already, even something as seemingly obscure as like Andrew Skirka's route over the Wind Rivers. I mean, that's on the internet too. I can find it and go replicate it. So I don't. It's really hard to know where to land, and I think the equity part of it is huge. The equity part of it is huge too, which is like, traditionally these places have been the domain of a certain type of person, and like, or at least in recent years, and it's really important for people of all kinds of backgrounds to connect to it, to reclaim their place in the wild. So yeah, gatekeeping is hugely risky, to be like, this type of person gets to go here, those who can dig deep or who have access to computers or to the internet, and then this type of person doesn't. That's a pretty toxic place to be. So, yeah, I don't know what the solution is there. I think, yeah, it's hard to know where to land on that. Like, I think, like, gatekeeping of any kind is shouldn't really be happening. Everyone should have an opportunity to access everything. But that said, I think you can make some personal decisions and personal choices where, like I said, the gram thing is out of the bag. Like, tagging places, like, that's maybe a little bit. I think that ship has kind of sailed, but it doesn't mean that you need to do it yourself. And then also, yeah, any place that's been beautiful has been tagged. So, like, almost from like a personal evangelism, I would be like, maybe don't do it, because you'll be more present and you'll be enjoying it yourself. But then also live your life in a way where you are willing to share it with people who are close to you. Take people out, spend time volunteering, with organizations that help get people outside. In many ways, I think, like, social media it just can be this multiplier. It can multiply for negative or for positive, and so it's like, maybe just take a little bit of a step outside of that and do some things in real life. That might be that might be one path, or it's at least it's one path that I feel okay about. So yeah, there's a portion of my book where there's a my upcoming book where there's a little bit of inherent irony in that I'm supposed to be writing about hidden gems in America's national parks, but the minute that this is published, assuming that I find a hidden gem, which I mean, everybody knows where everything is these days, but if I were to find one and then publish it, it's no longer hidden. Like there's a central irony to the book, and so what I hope to impart is to get people to find their park and to really get to know it and really get to love it and talk to people who live there and work there and really form a personal relationship with that park, because when you form a personal relationship with the parks or the people or anything, it stops being about like I got to go to that one place that I saw, that one time. It's you're not checking something off of a list. You're like, this is a place that I love and enjoy, and there are so many ways for me to enjoy it and so many ways for me to bring other people into it. And I think that's more important than any sort of narrow single place that you might check off of a list.
Yeah, Ted, you hit on a lot there, and I think that
Yeah.
it's really important at the end there to, that you pointed out that the love and enjoyment that's going to help lead to people being stewards of that area, having heightened conservation ethic, and that's really important. But yeah, you touched on the access versus conservation, and so my field of research is called visitor use management. We use
Mhm.
a lot of social psychology approaches to understand visitor experiences, and that's experiences in say national parks, public lands, U.S. Forest Service lands, and one of the tenets of my field is, if people have quality experiences, they're more likely to have boosted conservation ethic. They're more likely to become stewards and whatnot. But the situation that we're talking about here is a social situation. It's not
Mhm.
complicated. It's complex because it's a social situation and it's very contextual, maybe with
Yeah.
different places, maybe with different management agencies. You pointed that out earlier. One of the things right now that we see going on with management agencies, whether it's the Park Service, U.S. Forest Service, BLM, whatever it is, there's decreased funding. And with decreased funding means they may not have the resources to do as much active management.
Yeah.
And so they might have to do things that maybe if they had more funding and they could do more active management, they would do things differently. But I know that like we're seeing a lot more closures, especially I'm doing some research out in U.S. Forest Service land in California. And one of the things that we're looking at a
Mhm.
lot is different types of closures and level of public compliance with that.
Yeah.
And that's tough. That's not active management. That's something we got to close down, and we don't have the resources to do active management. Of course, though, it does come down to the context for the closure. But
Yeah.
then you also touched on the equity component. You also touched on some technology a little bit too. Like for me doing a skirker route, I used to do these routes with just pure map and compass. I
Mhm.
started them back in 2016, and I wouldn't bring a GPS. But now it's like I've come across people on skirker routes that did no research in advance. They download a GPS route on their phone, and they're essentially just following a digital trail. And they're not as prepared as what you would think for doing a route.
Yeah.
But with that GPS, they're going into places that were maybe a little bit harder to find when you had an app and compass and whatnot. And there's a possibility of sharing about that. But I think that what's important with this piece of conversation is that there is a big entanglement. It is complex. It's a social situation, but it is great to identify these different components of it, just to think that out
Mhm.
and apply it to these different contexts.
Yeah, definitely. It's so complicated, and like it's really hard to to find a way through. I just think like the more that you can kind of lead with your heart and with like goodwill, like you can maybe find a way through where if it's less like I and more like what do I want for this place and for other people, you can kind of let that go. Like I think a lot of people, there's going to be some tension, right? Because arches, for instance, like you can't get into arches. I believe this year, certainly last year, I think this year, and probably in the future, where you almost need tickets like Disneyland, Disney World to go inside ahead of time. You have to reserve your spots just because it's being hammered so much, and that's a place where if you truly love a place, say Arches or the Desert Southwest, exercise some patience and some compassion for our park workers and realize, hey, I don't have to go on my marquee place. I just love this place generally, and any day in it is a good day. So I'm gonna go choose something else that's not hammered as much, or I'm gonna pick I'm gonna pick another park and just have some like grace when you're out there, and like you might not get the route that you want, and but that's you're not gonna have a bad time. Like you're not gonna have a bad time when you kind of take a couple steps back. And similarly, there's a lot of a lot of tension built around like, oh, I want to go where the crowds aren't. But most people on the trail again are like pretty happy, and it takes a pretty extreme situation. Once you're on the trail, nobody likes traffic, etc. But once you're on the trail, it's pretty. And like you said, you see hikers one to one. It's like pretty hard. It takes an extreme amount of crowds to have a truly negative experience, And so just having some humility and being like, I need to share this place with other people. That's part of the thing.
Yeah, I think sharing responsibly is part of it for sure.
Yeah.
But yeah, gosh, it's definitely a tough one for sure. Yeah, yeah. Well, I appreciate you sharing all your knowledge about that. You've done a lot of writing on that too, and that's something that I've honestly not done much writing on in terms of from the research standpoint. But it's a conversation that comes up a lot in our
Yeah.
kind of just circular academic conversations.
Yeah, and there might be, I think there's always opportunities for, new information to come to light, new ways of handling things. I don't know. You never know. There might be some crazy, innovative solution that we're not thinking about that'll maybe help things. But I think we're in a really interesting time for figuring that out. So, I mean, I don't know. The pandemic is quote unquote sort of ending, so maybe people are going to go back to restaurants and bars. But I think visitation was down just slightly this year, as opposed to last year, maybe. So who knows?
Yeah, well, it seems like there's an indicator there that people are seeking some outdoor recreation, some outdoor opportunities. And, we
Hmm.
are extremely lucky, extremely blessed in the United States just to have a
Yeah,
magnificent park service. I mean, we have such a diversity of landscapes and whatnot. And we have a lot put aside. I mean, we are like,
completely.
compared to people that met from European countries, like, hey, we just didn't have that forethinking to put aside land the way the United States did.
Yeah.
So we're so lucky in a lot of ways. But we have, and it's awesome and it's so good for societal health to see so many people getting out and enjoying nature and enjoying the
Hmm.
outdoors. And I might be speaking a little too idealistic here, but gosh, it would be nice to almost set aside more land.
That's actually what I thought about as like an innovative solution, possibly that we're not thinking about is like you could set aside more land, or if we identify that like people are just drawn to the idea of a park, like it holds that much power as an idea, which it really does. You could turn, say, a section of the North Cascades that, or the Cascades that is not a park, or the Sierras that's not part of a national park, turn that into a new park, give it the marquee designation so that it attracts a certain set of people. And as a personal steward, it's like if you know a lot about national parks and they're getting hammered, you know you can maybe make the choice to be like, I'm going to leave some of these like precious places for others, and I'm going to go to some of the harder to get to places because I have the experience to do so. Like last year, I obviously, for writing a book about national parks, spent a ton of time in national parks. So this summer, I'm going to try and not go to national parks at all. I'm going to try and
Okay.
go to other wilderness areas, national forest land, BLM, etc. Just because I'm like, yeah, I spent a lot of time in parks, and so this year I can explore this other thing, and maybe do a tiny bit to alleviate some of the burden on the parks. And that's it's just a drop in the bucket. It just makes me feel good, but it's something you can do. And kind of going back to that patience thing, I had a conversation with a friend not too long ago where we talked about a sacrifice park, where you have certain parks that are going to be hammered with people, and maybe that's okay because you need that gateway, right? Like where North Cascades is not a sacrifice park. It's really hard to experience in full if you don't backpack. But out of the percentage of people who visit parks, the percentage that backpack are probably definitely not 50. I'm not sure what it would be, but pretty small. And so in that case, I have the ability to go experience North Cascades in its full, and Yosemite or Yellowstone, something like that. It's a sacrifice park. It's going to have the crowds. It's going to have all the people, but it's also the place where somebody from Iowa comes out and has their epiphany, where they're like, these places matter, protecting them matters, and they don't care that much about the traffic. They just saw a bison for the first time, or a bear, or Old Faithful, or whatever, and it's okay. And that's not to say that those places shouldn't be preserved or protected, but it's just like some places are going to exist as a gateway drug for parks, basically.
I think so. I think so. Like so, say like a family from Iowa or Kansas goes out to Yosemite, and it's their first time really getting into a natural space like that. It's the gateway drug. Maybe then in Iowa or Kansas, they decide to go to their state parks, something
Mm-hmm.
more local and whatnot. But part of this conversation, I was thinking about Kansas. I live in Kansas. I live in a lot of
Mm-hmm.
different states in the United States, and Kansas is our heartland. It's an ag state, and a
Yeah,
little bit more than 98% of our land is private land here. So we
yeah,
have like I think 1.8% of Kansas is public lands, and gosh, like I wish there was like a trans Kansas trail that could be used for like
yeah.
gravel road biking or backpacking. It'd have to go through. There'd have to be a significant amount of land bought up through private land. But sometimes I'm like, hey, if the federal government can't do this, would that be like just an awesome? I don't know how expensive it'd be, but would that just be like amazing, awesome marketing strategy for say Patagonia or the North Face, where they're like, hey, you know what?
Completely.
We're gonna buy up just like a narrow strip of land that's going to be like half a mile wide. You're gonna have a trail down the middle, and it's gonna traverse Kansas east to west. And we're just gonna we're gonna get that going, and we're gonna show how much we care, and probably would boost their sales. I don't know.
Completely. And I think you're touching on something like that's really interesting and important to me, which is that the way things have been done doesn't mean that that's the way it always has to be done. Like similarly, like there were like national parks were not, they were not a thing. And this country, we're fortunate, as you mentioned, that national parks are often called America's best idea. Like it was a new idea that then came about and created this bounty of this resource that has just been giving back and motivating, and has it's just been such a beacon of who we are. And so that's not to say there isn't a new idea like building this trail. Like okay, we're a corporate culture, and maybe you get corporate sponsors involved. Think outside the box. I'm drawn to in the Nordic countries, in most of the Nordic countries, they have this policy, and it's a governmental policy, and I believe it's called Allemansratten. It's like translated to all men's rights, and basically, and it dates back to Viking medieval times essentially, and the idea is that you may own land, but nobody has exclusive right to any patch of land. It's something that you share on some level. Every man has the right to move across the country, to move across the land. And so, although there is public land in Scandinavia, Norway, and Sweden is where I've done a little bit of research, but I believe they do this in Scotland too, or in parts
They
of
do.
Scotland. Yeah,
Yeah.
where you are allowed to move across private land. You're allowed to camp. Of course, there are regulations, and there are rules to follow. You leave no trace. You're only allowed to stay for a certain amount of time. But it's a different way of approaching it from private versus public. It's like maybe there is a different way of thinking about this, where it's where owners' rights are respected, but it's also shared in some way. And so that's just another way where like there could be some innovative thinking and some cultural changes that maybe alleviate some of this pressure and also give more people access to these types of things.
Yeah, and that's ultimately the thing, right? Give more access to these types of places, and I think that you point out a really great thing in that we don't have to look at this as a binary situation. Like there's,
Yeah.
maybe there's ways for people to pass through private land with respect.
Mhm. Yeah, and I think like it would take a lot in this
In America,
country
yeah.
to get people to feel comfortable with that. But it's not impossible. These things take a long time. I would wager that like most of the national parks that we have and public lands that we have, it's this constant tension. Like Arctic National Wildlife Reserve. Are we going to drill here? Is this set aside for conservation? It's this conversation, and so
Yeah.
it's going to be like that forever. And my main hope is that people just become as involved as they can be and see that as important, because that's we get more voices into this. We'll get more ideas and more solutions.
Yeah, I've actually put this at the end of a final to an undergrad class, and
Mm,
the question was like, "Hey, we live in the state of Kansas. Over 98% of the land is private land. How do we get more public land?" And there was actually quite a few students that said, "You know what? We're an agricultural state, and that's what my grandparents have done for their living. That's
hmm
what my parents have done for a living. And I don't want to compromise their land for public
Right.
land." And like, I was like, "Whoa!" Like, I never heard that perspective. It's really wonderful to hear that. And I was
Yeah.
really happy that got shared. But at the same time, so I'm in park management and conservation at Kansas State University, and we have a lot of enthusiasm for our program. It's a
Yeah.
popular program. It's awesome. And
Yeah.
people here, we don't have access to Rocky Mountain National Park's pretty far away. We don't have access to an iconic national park anywhere nearby. And
Yeah.
there's still people that are interested in getting out to public lands. They're interested in studying this, and so the desire to be outside is there for sure. It's been a wonderful conversation with you. This
Yeah.
is
This
something
has been
that
great.
I could talk to you for another few hours. I feel like, and this has been rolling. This has just been rolling. Like, I can't even believe that we've been recording for close for an hour and 20 minutes. And I feel like we've covered a lot of great topics. But I think
Yeah.
that, at this point, maybe we should call it an episode, and maybe I'll think
Sure.
about bringing it back on the Old Bodies Outside after your book gets released in 2024.
Yeah. Yeah. April of next year. Yeah.
Okay, nice, nice. Well, Ted, thanks a lot for coming on to Old Bodies Outside. It was really awesome to connect with a journalist, someone who has just a plethora of experience and history out in the outdoors with what you do. Sometimes I get caught up in this like very esoteric academia type of approaches and whatnot. And so it's just wonderful for me to talk to someone outside of academia who's really an expert in these topics. So thank you for coming on to Old Bodies Outside.
Oh, thank you. It's been an honor to be here, and yeah, I really enjoyed my time, and I always love talking about this stuff, and I'm really excited that that your audience is going to hear it and engage with it and keep the conversation moving forward.
All right. And of course, my outro music's no longer working.
Well, you've got guitars there. I've got guitars here. We can come up with something really quickly.
Toss some G chords out there real quick.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, here I'll also cut that out. So let me do like a little exit point here. So hey Ted, we're gonna
Yep.
call an episode, and thank you so much for coming on to Old Bodies Outside. This has been fantastic.
Thanks so much.
All right, take care.